A city with many public luxuries and ever-shifting public spaces is Istanbul. And we're going to hear now from the Deputy Secretary General from the Mayor's Office in Istanbul, Mr. Ibrahim Orhan Demir. And just a quick note, he'll be speaking Turkish, and we're going to hand out headsets here with translation from Turkish to English so everyone can follow along. Mr. Demir, welcome to Berlin Questions.
Çok teşekkür ediyorum.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Hello to everyone. Now, the cities have been shaped by diseases like cholera or the plague, for example. And of course, infrastructures came into question when this hit. This time, during the pandemic, we have seen that not only the infrastructure, but the social lives in a city were also important. And indeed, the citizens' lives were touched. Especially in emerging economies, the urban poverty has risen, which has boosted the spirit of solidarity once again. And the family ties have been recovered, which were forgotten. And we also noticed how bad we were to the nature, the harm we were doing to nature. And natural life was all given away for the sake of the buildings and concrete. And there was no room for the people to meet with the nature itself. This is why the way we use land in the cities will very much be affected from now on. Another impact of the pandemic was the following. In a city like Istanbul, where you have 16 million residents, we have also seen the wrong use of land. I mean, here's what I'm trying to say. We
arazi kullanım biçiminde ne kadar yanlış olduğunu gördük.
Serving for a larger area, whereas one could possibly think in a smaller scale. And then, because of the pandemic, again, people's habits have also changed. In the past, people used to have face-to-face relationships, and now there they were, residing in their own personal areas, and had less of an interaction. And fewer people used the public transportation, obviously. And people rather used their cars, or they stayed at home rather than traveling somewhere. Of course, this reminded us of the neighborhood sort of, way of living back in the day, when people wouldn't travel as much and everything was more local. And of course, we are revisiting our plans regarding Istanbul to meet all these newer demands now. And of course, this sort of withdrawal from the public spheres of Istanbul, or this sort of individualization, brought also about a more anti-democratic structure, because when people lose their ties, when people have less of a relationship with each other, they no longer have their ideas interacting with each other. This is why the democratic demands were no longer being voiced as much as in the past. So this all seemed like an advantage. But in other areas, in countries like ours, emerging economies, or a city like Istanbul, quite dynamic with 16 million people, turned to a disadvantage. And of course, having said that, we have redefined our priorities. Unfortunately, so far in our cities, the valleys were important. If you know Istanbul, you know what I'm talking about. There is the eastern-western axis in Istanbul, and the city has developed in that direction. And because of its structure, there are many rivers actually flowing into the Marmara Sea. But because of the buildings all around the city, they were no longer used as land, but as building area. And this is why we have seen that around these rivers, we need to have more green areas. And we have redefined those areas around the rivers as new green living areas. And then because of social distancing, or rather physical distancing, people started needing more open air areas. And there were areas which were used as, forest areas before, and now they weren't open to public use, but we had to open it for public use. 6 million square meters of area have been redesigned as a park so that people could use it as a recreational area. And then, of course, the real impact of the pandemic showed its face in the area of health. And new developments have taken place in that area. And the public spheres are now being used more and more, and it became more accessible. And of course, people adopted new transportation methods to get from A to B. And it seems like the whole world is going to evolve in that sort of a direction. We will see that, of course, people will become more and more individualistic, probably, and that people will need more and more open air spaces. In terms of land use or in terms of face-to-face interaction, it will be more important to be out in the open air, and this is what we'll focus on.
Thank you, Mr. Demir. We have a translation. We've been listening to you hear the translation in English, and I'd ask you a few questions as well back. I found it very interesting that you just said that
Tabii ki, buyurun.
people have been withdrawing from public spaces, and that creates anti-democratic structures, and that the cities responded essentially by creating new green living areas along rivers, for example. Is it working? Are people coming back out to engage and break down some of those anti-democratic structures?
Şimdi tabii
Yes. Of course, we haven't overcome the pandemic fully, so I can only say that previous to the pandemic, our public transport system used to carry about 7 million people, and now we're at about 5 million passengers. And during the height of the lockdown, it was down to 1.5 million passengers. So basically, we have a decrease of public transport usage to capacity of about 20%. But people's habits are also changing. So a lot of people used to be commuting and are now working from home, and they have understood that this is actually possible and sustainable. And this has allowed them to save on spendings on transport and commuting. And this means that we are seeing a kind of long-term change of habits. And I think we'll see new forms of behavior in using public spaces. Now, do people really come out to fill up those public spaces? We think that's going to happen. We think that's increasingly going to happen, and we're seeing initial attempts on part of the people. But we also think that it's up to us to actually create those spaces so people can fill them up and use them for their democratic demands. And I think the more spaces we open and create, the more the people will use them.
You said democratic demands. You see certainly times that people have come out in the streets in Berlin in the pandemic have been to voice their demands, to engage in dialogue with each other, to protest. So how important are those public spaces like Gezi Park, for example, in Istanbul, for citizens there to protest, to engage with each other?
Tabii ki birkaç açıdan önemli aslında.
I think they're important in quite a number of aspects. First of all, they need to come out to actually breathe and basically just catch them fresh air. But at the same time, as you just implied, these are spaces that are vital for voicing democratic demands. And we all remember the process of Gezi Park. That was a good example where you could see that there was an unorganized tendency of especially young people to come together and express their democratic demands, which were brutally suppressed, but still people were coming out, and it's very, very important to keep these spaces alive so people can use them. I think that most of you will remember that there was a concept of public plazas, of public spaces that's different from the plazas in Central Europe. Most of our public spaces basically are crossroads and have been open to traffic. And last year we developed projects to transform 13 of these crossroad plaza spaces to actually open them up for pedestrian use and restrict car passage. And another thing we did in order to create public spaces, we picked projects that were basically open for public vote. So the citizens were allowed to vote their favorite project as to how their local plaza should be transformed. And that, as I said, is part of a process of democratizing on a municipal level where people can actually decide how the spaces they're already using or they want to use should be transformed. And I think that's also important in terms of their democratic demands.
Thank you, Mr. Demir, for that report from Istanbul. Ibrahim Orhan Demir, the Secretary General, Deputy Secretary General in the Mayor's Office.